I'm Joseph McMeans, a doctoral candidate in philosophy here at St. Patrick's College, and I'll be chairing this next session. We will be shifting gears a little bit with these upcoming talks, first hearing from Laurella Consionti, followed by Tim Powell, both of whom I've been given the privilege to introduce. The format of these sessions will remain the same as the previous. Each guest will speak for approximately 40 minutes, followed by a 10-minute response, leaving another 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Our first speaker, Professor Laurella Consionti, received her doctoral degree in philosophy from Tor Vergata, the Second University of Rome, and her license in sacred theology from St. Thomas Aquinas at the Pontifical University in Rome. Since the academic year 2000, she has been teaching philosophy of nature and metaphysics at the Pontifical Urbaniana University in Vatican City. She is currently president of the International Society of St. Thomas Aquinas and was also the first woman vice president of the Pontifical Urbaniana University from 2013 to 2017. Her areas of interest and research are philosophical cosmology, with particular focus on the finalism of nature and on the specificity of human beings, and also on questions of boundaries, especially those aspects of philosophy that have direct relevance to the issues related to science and religion. She is the author and editor of 7 monographs, 6 published in Italian, and her most recent, Outlines of the Philosophy of Nature, was published in English this past year. Professor Consionti will be speaking to us today not only on the future of Christian metaphysics, but on the future of Thomism in particular. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over. Professor Consionti, it's a privilege to have you with us. Feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you for this introduction. Thank you to all the academic authorities of St. Patrick's College, and in particular, thanks to Dr. Gavin Kerr. I met him a lot of years ago in Maynooth, and I met him again more recently, thanks to a conference hosted by the Thomistic Institute of Angelicum, organized by Father Thomas White. I have only 3 slides for you. So, the future of Thomistic thought. 3 slides, one for the past, one for the present, and one for the future. Thomistic thought has a long past, with different grades of success and diffusion. A peculiar moment was in 1879, when Pope Leo XIII promulgated the encyclical Aeterni Patris, proposing Thomas Aquinas as the master of philosophical and theological thought. In number 26, we can read, "Our first and most cherished idea is that you should all furnish to studious youth a generous and copious supply of those pure streams of wisdom, flowing inexhaustibly from the precious fountainhead of the angelic doctor." After this encyclical, there were different movements, quite opposed to each other. A deep interest in the real text of Thomas, but also a reduction of his thought in the layout of handbooks, often very schematic, basic, and restricted. A great diffusion of Thomistic studies, but also a real aversion against Thomas Aquinas, considered as an imposition by the Church. The so-called neo-scholasticism, consequent to Aeterni Patris, is characterized by different phases. For example, we can distinguish 3 historical philosophical neo-Thomist generations. The first generation is focused on Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics. The second one underlines the authenticity of Thomistic metaphysics and the biblical influences on it. The third generation is focused on Neoplatonic Thomistic metaphysics. There are also 2 phases of theoretical Neo-Thomism, one defensive, the other dialogical. At the present, Thomistic thought is living a complex moment. It is not the prevalent stream of philosophical and theological thought, but there are a lot of Thomistic studies, Thomistic publications, and Thomistic varieties. For example, Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press dedicated respectively a companion and a handbook to Thomas Aquinas and a lot of other publications. Among these, there are also the precious books by Gavin Kerr, of course. Some scholars underline that New Thomism speaks English and no more French or German languages. And this is certainly true. But there are also Italian studies with great names and new young ones. In Rome, we are living the good success of the joint diploma in Thomistic studies, organized by all the Pontifical Roman universities, with great scholars as teachers and very different kinds of people as students. And above all, we do not forget the great quantity of Spanish studies. In Spain, for example, Barcelona's and Pamplona's groups, but also in South America, above all in Argentina. Ralph McInerney called the contemporary Thomism freelance Thomism because new scholars are prevalently lay people not linked to particular Thomistic institutions. It is not a homogeneous Thomism, and it is prevalently not theological but philosophical. Ashley distinguishes 8 varieties of Thomistic metaphysics. He wrote, "There are today at least 8 chief ways of understanding Aquinas' views on the nature of metaphysics, marked by different concerns about how it can best be employed to solve present-day problems. These concerns are not necessarily contradictory, yet neither are they easy to reconcile. While all Thomists hold that the subject of metaphysics is being as being understood analogically, they differ as to how we know this subject. So, metaphysics as the science of being as being understood analogically is still the common definition of Thomistic thought. These 8 varieties are called essentialist Thomism, Platonizing Thomism, transcendental Thomism, existential, phenomenological, analytic, semiotic, Aristotelian Thomism. Perhaps they are not so distinct and separate, but they are shadows of the same light. There is also a peculiar reference to Thomas Aquinas' notions in ethical fields, above all on virtues and natural law. But what is the future of Thomistic thought? In my opinion, we can focus very briefly on 4 different fields: the science-faith relationship, the integral ecology, holistic studies, and last but not the least, Asian and African Thomistic studies. This is just the scheme of my paper about the future of Thomistic thought. And now it's better face to face. So, in the science-faith relationship, so point number 1, there is yet a concrete interest in Thomistic thought. Also, non-Thomistic scholars recognize that Thomas Aquinas has developed a fruitful dialogical relation between reason and faith. Thomas had not a notion of science similar to contemporary sciences. He couldn't know the problem arising from the contemporary scientific theories and from the experimental mathematical sciences as such. But he had a very wide concept of reason and of science, useful also today for understanding the different paths of reason and faith and the possibility of their complementarity. I think this is really a way to further future effects. In fact, there is every way the need for philosophical foundation of science. For example, the scientist Carlo Rovelli recently wrote an essay in Scientific American entitled Physics Needs Philosophy, Philosophy Needs Physics. He wrote, a certain current anti-philosophical ideology has had damaging effects on the fertility of science, whereas philosophy has always played an essential role in the development of science, physics in particular, and is likely to continue to do so. Some scholars rightly write that the problem is a wrong interpretation of metaphysics. Metaphysics is understood as a priori knowledge about the nature of reality. This is the wrong interpretation. While a strong interest in ontology and epistemology within artificial intelligence and robotics has demonstrated how important metaphysics can be, not only for science, but even for technology. I think that we can find in Thomistic metaphysics a sort of meeting point between different fields of knowledge. Referring especially to Super Boetium de Trinitate, but also to the first question of the part 1 of Summa Theologiae, and not only to this question, of course, we can conclude that some human sciences proceed from principles that are known by the light of the natural intellect, like arithmetic and geometry. Others, however, proceed from principles that are known by the light of superior sciences, like the science of perspective, which proceeds from principles that are known through geometry, and music from principles that are known through arithmetic. Sacred doctrine is a science that proceeds from principles that are known by the light of superior sciences, which is the wisdom of God and the saints. So the same notions of science is multiplied in the field of human sciences by virtue of different degrees of abstraction or separation, remaining always in the ambit of a knowledge that can be brought back to principles that are known by reason and through the light of the intellect. But it is also multiplied in a further dimension. Also, sacred doctrine is a science, and it is a subordinate science, like music and perspective. The uniqueness is that sacred doctrine is subordinate to a science that is not human, but is the wisdom of God and the saints. It appears to be fruitful to apply the distinction between subordinate and subordinating sciences proper to the Aristotelian tradition to the relationships among all knowledge. In this context, the most important science, which is the end, never the means, is the subordinating science, never the subordinate ones, and is architectural in the highest degree, is metaphysics. Metaphysics may be the model of metadiscipline. The metadisciplinarity is the most advanced model of relationship between different sciences, better than transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. Some scholars propose to translate the Greek term metaphysics as meta-science, and I think it is a very good idea in this context. Metaphysics is unique because it deals with the reality that is ontologically first, and because it deals with it rationally, starting from the experience of physical reality. Because of this characteristic typology, it shares some aspects with the science, because they are both rational researches, even in diversity of question and methodology. And it shares other aspects with theology, because they share the sapiential openness to the first reality, even in the diversity of means, only natural for metaphysics, but also supernatural for theology. Therefore, metaphysics constitutes a meeting place, but also a structure that makes possible the conjoining of knowledge. Point number 2. About the integral ecology field, I am specifically referring to the encyclical Laudato Si, written by Pope Francis, and to the varieties of studies emerging from it. I believe that it may be sufficient to hold the joint diploma in integral ecology up as a good example. It is another alliance between all the Pontifical University in Rome for studying and teaching the contents of Laudato Si. In the encyclical, there are a lot of quotations of Thomas Aquinas. In number 86, 3 quotations from the Summa Theologiae. In number 80, a quotation from the Summa Theologiae and 1 from Commentary on the Physics of Aristotle. And note 171 of number 240 refers to 3 places in the Summa Theologiae, above all referring to the notion of nature as an integral whole and as an inner principle in physical reality that moves them to natural goals. In number 86, we can read, the universe as a whole, in all its manifold relationships, shows forth the inexhaustible riches of God. St. Thomas Aquinas wisely noted that multiplicity and variety come from the intention of the first agent, who willed that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another, inasmuch as God's goodness could not be represented fittingly by any one creature. Hence, we need to grasp the variety of things in their multiple relationships. We understand better the importance and meaning of each creature if we contemplate it within the entirety of God's plan. All the quotations in this passage 86 come from question 47 of the part 1 of the Summa Theologiae, which is dedicated to the plurality and distinction of things, and serve to argue that the complexity and complementarity of creatures in the totality of their relationship are an expression of divine goodness and express God's plan. Nature, understood as the internal essence of things themselves, is explained in the Laudato Si with reference to the commentary on Aristotle's Physics by St. Thomas Aquinas. In number 80, we can read, nature is nothing other than a certain kind of art, namely God's art, impressed upon things, whereby those things are moved to a determinate end. It is as if a shipbuilder were able to give timber the wherewithal to move themselves to take the form of a ship. Therefore, nature is the rational principle that God the Creator wrote in things themselves and that moves them to the end, as if the shipbuilder could give the wood the ability to take the shape of the ship, as Thomas Aquinas wrote. It seems that the dynamic spirit of Thomistic thought is being recovered, saving the manuals that had not satisfied the young Bergoglio, recovering, as he recently wrote, the genius of Thomas Aquinas, the depth and originality of St. Thomas Aquinas. I think there is a true Thomistic metaphysical frame in this encyclical, not unusual in Bergoglio's thought, as Massimo Borghese noted in his reconstruction of Bergoglio's intellectual journey. Borghese wrote, a Thomistic character is one of the constants of Bergoglio's thinking. This is where his gnoseological metaphysical realism and his appreciation of the tangible world find their source. Only a metaphysical foundation linked to an anthropological vision can sustain the integral ecology, and this is the peculiar and inner difference between integral ecology and other kinds of ecology. The reference to Thomas is not a very enlightened aspect of Pope Francis' thought, but I think it holds much for the future. I would like to stress the proceedings by the Pontifical Academy of Thomas Aquinas dedicated to the Thomistic metaphysics of creation in this ecological perspective in 2018. Point number 3. The holistic field is remarkably interesting, according to me, but it requires a deep philosophical foundation for not becoming an undifferentiated and irrational all is one. Whole is, in its various forms, also knows exaggerations and extremities, risk in itself becoming a form of reductionism of the parts towards the whole, resulting in underestimation of the identity of the parts. This appears, for example, in some forms of deep ecology, in which holism risks degenerating into hostility towards human individuals. In addition, it appears to be declined in some cases in forms of extreme scientism and in other cases in forms of mysticizing spiritualism. The question of the relationship between the parts and the whole has already been the subject of reflection in the history of thought, and in particular by Aristotle. In Book 8 of Metaphysics, we read, "The whole is more than the parts." The notion of substance as a synolon, such as the very strict union of matter and form as a whole, offers metaphysical foundation to a conception of the whole that completely exceeds the sum of the parts, because the parts exist only in the whole unity. Thomas Aquinas offers important theoretical tools for this enterprise. About the role of the substantial form, he wrote in Summa Theologiae, "The substantial form perfects not only the whole, but each part of the whole. For since a whole consists of parts, a form of the whole which does not give existence to each of the parts of the body is a form consisting in composition and order." He also offers interesting further reflection in the commentary in Metaphysics. He wrote, "It must be noted that all things which have several parts, and of which the whole is not merely a heap of parts, but is something constituted of parts, and is over and above the parts themselves, have something that makes them one." We can see that the whole is not a heap, in Latin coacervatio, but a deep form of unity, unitas, that is beyond the same parts. In Quaestio Disputata de Potentia number 3, article 6, Thomas Aquinas wrote, "The fault was that they considered things in reference to the things themselves, or in the mutual relationships between one individual thing and another, but not as bearing upon the order of the universe, the totality of the universe. All things must be traced to one first principle, which is good. So there is the necessity to resolve everything to a first principle, that is the principle of the order." Finally, this is a question of wisdom, understanding reality as a whole. I think these 3 points are intimately correlated. The question of relationship between reason and faith, the ecological question, and the holistic fields are all questions of totality. The ontological frame of Thomistic thought consents to analyze different grades of beings and different grades of knowledge without confusion and without separation. For example, I study with precision the recurrence of the distinction between per se and per accidens in the Thomistic writings, and it consents a wide approach to infinite question of order. Number 4. Finally, there is an important point, quite different from the previous, but the most important to me. We live in a very broad world, and the future can be only Western, but it can be only globalized in a relativistic way. I think Thomas Aquinas' thought offers to the world important keys for reflection, but above all, I think that non-Western scholars may offer a great occasion of future life for Thomistic thought. I want to explain better this point. Above all, the Thomistic notion of human beings requires that all human beings are essentially the same, and if this is really true, Thomistic thought is a thought for everyone, in different cultures and in different languages, thanks to human reason. So I think the real future of Thomism must comprehend Asian Thomism and African Thomism. We know the past and the present show us a lot of European, North America, and South American varieties of Thomism. But I think, and I hope, in an expansion toward South and East. The true question is the diffidence towards Thomas, perceived as a stranger. But some scholars are able to use Thomas Aquinas for his universal values. There are some important signs in the present. For example, there are interesting studies on the relationship between Thomism and Asian thought. See, for example, the Thomism and Asian cultures, proceedings of an international congress in the University of St. Thomas in Manila, Philippines, in 2011. Quite interesting is the aim of the Congress, that is the aim of this university in Philippines, expressed in the introduction. Thomism is in the University of St. Thomas has kept up with the times, which is the reason for its enduring presence. But at the same time, no philosophy of the West, either continental or analytic, and no philosophy of the East, from the ancients to the postmodern, has not been heard within the university's portals with its dialogical effort across civilization. There is not exclusion in the philosophy of Thomism. It is interesting because the problem of Thomism as a Western thought is surpassed. Thomism is part of the history of humanity, and it is open for every human culture. In Asia, there are also some good Thomistic scholars in China. For example, the young Wu Tianyue, professor in the philosophy department at Peking University. He has devoted himself to reconstructing philosophical arguments in St. Augustine and in St. Thomas as a way of explaining new intellectual resources. Recently, his lecture in Chinese on Thomistic anthropology was shared by Angelicum, the Dominican University in Rome. Another example is an older scholar, Matthias Lu, born in 1919 in Baoding in the northern Hebei. He studied in Urbaniana in Rome, and he translated in Chinese the Principis Naturae, De Ente de Essentia, Expositio in Boetie de Hebdomadibus, Tractatus de Spiritualis Creaturis, and some parts of Summa Contra Gentiles. The complete translation of Summa Theologiae was made by Taiwanese priest scholars and took 30 years to finish, and they finished about 10 years ago. There is a particular consonance between Thomistic thought and Chinese thought for the use of the principle of authority in the comparative dialogue between previous different positions and the precise use of reason in understanding reality. Translations are as important for new Thomistic studies as the Latin translation of Aristotle's work and of his commentators were in medieval age. In Asia, Thomistic thought arrived before the text, but a mature and authentic work is possible only thanks to translation. The African case is complex and interesting and involves not only philosophy, but also theology and social problematics. I want to underline, for example, the recent collective volume, The Role of Philosophy in the African Context, The quotation of Thomas are referred to on the question of peace, and this is really interesting, a social problem, the peace. And then I would like to briefly speak about the Tanzanian theologian Charles Nyamiti, born in 1931 and died in 2020, as a true example of the search of an African theology using Thomistic thought. It is comprehensible that Nyamiti's thought is famous above all because it is in a certain way the starting point of an African theology. But I think it is really deep because Nyamiti explicitly used the best of the Thomistic metaphysics for his work. The African theologian Charles Oborgi, now teacher in Rome, remembers that when the Congolese thinker Benezet Bujo criticized Nyamiti for trying to fashion African theology on the model of the European speculative scholastic and neo-scholastic tradition, Nyamiti responded, "Does eating African rice with European spoon make the rice also European? It is interesting. You can eat better your rice if you use a Western spoon. So you can understand better your identity as an African and as a human being if you use Thomistic tools." But I think that this path is only at the beginning, and this could be a virtuous positive circle. Thomistic thought may offer to African thought a solid foundation, and in converse, African scholars may unveil new effects from Thomistic seeds. I personally know Godfrey Ona, former professor of philosophy of man in my university and now Bishop of Nsukka in Nigeria. He wrote a very interesting essay that may be a sort of foundation for this trend of thought. One nature, different culture. Just yesterday, Godfrey Ona gave a lecture hosted by Leiden University about dialogue between African and Asian philosophy. And the lecture was also a contribution to a study on Thomism and intercultural dialogue. And the conclusion was presented in the style of Summa Theologiae, the same methodology. But above all, I know my students from Asia and from Africa in Urbaniana and their researches and the activity of the seminaries affiliated to Urbaniana all over the world. My students from Africa and from Asia love Thomistic thought, and some of them made interesting researches on different African culture and Asian cultures using Thomistic ontology. They discover interesting convergences and unexpected horizons. Thomistic thought is a thought for human beings, the closest to the natural way of thinking, and in the same time, the most cultivated. I hope that it continues to be the fundamental base for philosophical and theological teaching. From this base, new scholars can spring. Thomistic thought is, in fact, the best method for teaching. And I think this is real an important point because the future of Thomism is strictly linked to the diffusion in the education field. From this basic level, deeper level of research may be born. I know the Christian context, but perhaps also in non-Christian context, Thomistic studies may flourish. As Kenny writes about a study of Thomas that transcends the limits not only of the Catholic Church, but of Christian itself. In conclusion, the future of Thomistic thought lies in ever new interpretation of Thomas' writings, as Eterni Patri said in the past. In fact, in number 31, we can read, "The doctrine of Thomas be drawn from his own fountains, or at least from those rivulets which derive from the very fount, have thus far flowed according to the established agreement of learned men pure and clear." Because in this text there are the fundamental metaphysical principles that are seeds for potentially infinite new flowers. In number 18, we can read, the angelic doctor pushed his philosophical inquiry into the reasons and principles of things, which, because they are most comprehensive, it contains in their bosom, so to say, the seeds of almost infinite truth, were to be unfolded in good time by later masters and with a goodly yield. So this is the motive of the perennial vitality of the Thomistic thought every time and everywhere. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Consionti, for that wonderful and enlightening talk. I'll now briefly hand it over to Dr. Gavin Kerr, our Aquinas specialist here at St. Patrick's College.
All right, thanks everyone. It's good to see you. Thanks very much for all your input today. It's been great crack so far. So I'll just give a quick, sort of 10-minute little, sort of response to that. It's not even a response because, I agree with everything Professor Consionti says. We Thomists are a funny bunch. We tend to agree with each other on some things and then viciously disagree with each other on other things. So the question, the future of Thomism. Does Thomism have a future? I mean, you say that to a Thomist. A Thomist will say, that, well, that's a synthetic a priori. Necessarily and universally true in every possible world, yet synthetic and tells us something which isn't tautologous, that Thomism does have a future. What I want to maybe focus on just for the next few minutes or so is I think it's right for Professor Consionti to point out the various green shoots of Thomism coming up in a lot of different philosophical voices in different areas, and especially in places which were not traditionally dealt with by Thomists. I think that speaks something to the vitality of Thomism, that it's not just restricted to traditional philosophical and theological concerns, but that it's malleable enough. It's not just a univocal system self-contained within itself, but that it's malleable enough that it can deal with issues and engage in various contexts that it didn't traditionally deal with before. What I want to focus on in Professor Consionti's paper is this issue of the universality of human nature across geographical and temporal regions and the resulting appeal of Thomism, regardless of differences in space and time. To my mind, it must be the case that a good philosophy is in principle capable of appealing to someone, regardless of their social and cultural circumstances. And I think Thomism does that. I think Thomism does have that appeal to anybody, regardless of the circumstances that they find themselves in, regardless of the time in which they find themselves in working. Thomism as a philosophical position, and indeed as a metaphysics, is capable of speaking to any sort of philosophical tradition, to any human being who takes the task of thinking seriously. And I think the reason why a good philosophy has to be capable of appealing to someone regardless of circumstance is because philosophy is a practice of rational individuals. It's something that a rational individual engages in, and this rationality is present within every social and cultural circumstance. Okay, so the social and cultural circumstance emanate almost like a second nature from the rational individual, so that a philosophy which appeals to the rational individual can transcend social and cultural circumstances and not bounded by them. And I think that Thomism does this. In particular, I think that Thomism does this with regard to metaphysics. And we can see this, we can see why this is so when we look at the subject matter of metaphysics according to St. Thomas. On a number of occasions, Aquinas holds that being or ends is what the intellect first conceives, and he follows Avicenna in this. He doesn't mean here, when he talks about, the intellect conceiving being, he doesn't mean any post-Cartesian sense of having some representational content in the mind, some representation of being in the mind, which is in turn taken to represent reality in some adequate fashion, so long as the right, sort of components, checks and balances are in place. That's not Thomas at all. He's not modern in that way. He doesn't have a post-Cartesian notion of mentality. Mentality for Thomas isn't something located in a private space, such as the mind, or in a part of the body, such as the brain. Mentality for Thomas is just a feature of the being of a rational substance. Humans are rational animals. Rationality is an expression of their animality. It's a feature of their being in the world. So what the rational substance is primarily aware of before any higher level conceptualizing is the being of things. You can't miss the being of things. It's impossible. You exist in the world with other beings, and so the being of things just fills you. They're always present. So the sheer reality of things, independent of oneself, is always there and always present, and one can't escape it. It's inescapable. So for Aquinas, we're confronted by being. We can't escape this. And so when it comes to engaging with being in a methodologically strict sense, in the way that we do in the various sciences, the sciences are going to be differentiated then on the basis of how we engage with being, i.e. in terms of their formal object. So what is our particular focus will determine the subject matter of the science within which we're engaged. So, as is well known for Thomas, physics deals with things subject to matter and motion for their being, but not for their being and for their being understood. Sorry. Mathematics deals with things subject to matter and motion for their being, but not for their being understood. Metaphysics deals with things subject to matter and motion, neither for their being nor for their being understood. In each case, what you have is a particular focus on the intellect, on being in some sort of way, until you get to metaphysics, which doesn't carve off any sort of portion of being, but just focuses on the being of things itself. The various realities then that metaphysics considers are those conditions of being that would apply to all beings, material or immaterial. So for example, substance, potency, form, act, unity, and all the rest. The starting point of Thomistic metaphysics then, it's not some immaterial substance. Okay, so contrary to the River Forest school and contrary, to some other, philosophers of nature who see some primacy in the philosophy of nature before metaphysics, the starting point of Thomist metaphysics isn't some immaterial substance. You don't need to know that God or the angels or an immaterial soul exists before you do metaphysics. Rather, it's simply to think metaphysically about the medium-sized dry goods before us. Furthermore, the starting point of Thomist metaphysics, it's not some immobile first substance that one only accepts if one accepts a certain philosophy of nature terminating in a first immobile thing, such as Aristotelian physics or Newtonian physics. The starting point of Aquinas' metaphysics prescinds from all of that, prescinds from all those theoretical considerations, and focuses on the experience that the rational individual has of being qua being, and then begins to conceptualize that experience in terms of the various categories without which a thing would not be. So to understand these metaphysical categories then requires no more than an awareness of the being of things and an engagement with the various extant literature. So in engaging in Thomistic metaphysics, it makes no difference what cultural, temporal, geographical, linguistic contexts one finds oneself in. In all of these contexts, being can be experienced because what you have is a rational individual engaged with being. And so the Thomistic categories by which being is understood can be taken to apply to the being of things that one experiences anyway, regardless of one is in Ireland, the Philippines, Asia, regardless of whether one is in the 20th century, the 15th century, 13th century. Being can be experienced in the same way by all individuals, and so can be conceptualized in terms of the various, metaphysical categories that Thomas outlines. So it's my contention then that Thomistic metaphysics will have a future for as long as there are rational individuals who engage with the being of things and seek to think through what it means to be. In other words, we will have Thomistic metaphysics so long as we have metaphysicians. And it doesn't look like metaphysicians are going anywhere anytime soon. So it doesn't look like Thomistic metaphysics is going to go anywhere anytime soon. So that's what I have to say in response to Professor Consionti's paper. Not so much a disagreement, so a full support and agreement. So thanks to Professor Consionti. You're great, you're grand, you're wonderful. I agree with everything you say. And so over to questions now.
So we've actually have about 15 minutes before we need to move on to the next panel. So Professor Consionti, would you like the chance to briefly respond to Dr. Kerr before we move on to questions?
Only thank you. We totally agree. I totally agree with Gavin. So thank you very much.
So we have one question from the audience, two coming up. The first one is from Don, it looks like. So question for Dr. Consionti. Are you conceiving of this future of Thomistic thought in regards to Catholicism only, though I don't recall you suggesting this? Or does it include Protestant and even non-Christian Thomistic thought, such as the reintroduction of an Aristotelian Thomistic understanding of reality within science? Thanks.
Yes, it is a fact that the presence of Thomistic studies is in Catholic tradition. But I think not only in Catholic tradition. When I studied in Angelicum, the Dominican University in Rome, I have classmates from different kinds of Christianism. So there are still no Catholic scholars in an interesting way. But I think the future may be more universal than now. So I hope in an expansion of Thomistic thought, not only in Catholic tradition, but in Christian tradition and also in non-Christian tradition, for the specific motive that Gavin Kerr underlined before. Thomistic thought is for rational human beings. So this is in a certain way before the differences between different kinds of Christianism. This is important for the philosophical root of Thomistic thought. I know that Thomas was a theologian, not a philosopher. It was not a philosopher as Aristotle before Christianity, and he was not a philosopher in the modern way, so or in postmodern way against Christianity. It was a theologian, but in his theology there is a so deep job, a so deep work of reason that we can find a solid philosophy. So you can use your reason in a Thomistic way before the enlightenment of faith, not only in the conjoining of reason and faith. This is very important to me. I know Thomas was a theologian. This is an evidence, but now we can find solid foundation for philosophical researches. So not linked to Catholic tradition, to Christianity and so on, but for human beings as human beings.
Great, thank you. Caitlin, would you like to expound upon your insight here, or are you...
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is when you're dealing with wisdom texts, you're not going to have a fully westernized systematic philosophy. So I would ask Dr. Consionti, how does she, in teaching, approach that dialogue in a genuine way that allows that, in many ways, those mytho-poetic aphoristic texts that you see in something like the Rig Veda, and the very systematic exploration of things like essence and existence in St. Thomas Aquinas. How do you present them in a way in which they grow in union without reducing the integrity of each as their own, in a sense, installation?
I think the problem is the meaning of systematic. What does it mean? I think if we read directly Thomas Aquinas' writings, we can find a different meaning of systematic, not a sort of box, not a series of boxes. This is the problems of Thomistic handbooks, Thomistic manuals, that so often were too much systematic in a not living way. So this systematic approach hasn't many possibilities to dialogue with different traditions. But if we read directly Thomas Aquinas, we can discover not an exterior systematic movement, but the vitality of the reasonment, the dialogue between human beings and the nature, human beings and other human beings and God. So I think only thanks to the direct reading of Thomas Aquinas' poems, Thomas Aquinas' sources, Thomas Aquinas' writings, we can discover the true Thomistic thought. And I think this is very important.
Yeah, and I think that takes us back to Dr. Newsom Martin's paper, where we have to wean ourselves off of that ready-made manualist Thomism that degenerates Thomism. And I think it also prevents genuine dialogue. So you get a kind of facile dialogue rather than an intensive unfolding one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we can go ahead and move on to our next question from Alberto Quiroz. Dr. Consionti, could you please explain further the metadisciplinarity of metaphysics, of the metaphysics you propose?
Yes, it is not my original idea. So, you know, there are different models of relationship between different kinds of science. This is a new trend of philosophical thought. Transdisciplinarity is very interesting because it's the search of new relationship between different kinds of science, not only a science in a series of science, but the discovery of new roads between the different science. But metadisciplinarity is the search of the meta language, the meta theory that can explain the different paths, the different relationships between the sciences and the different kinds of knowledge. So metadisciplinarity is the search of a science that is able to give structure, foundation and structure to the building of the sciences. I think the image of building is very clear. So we need a science that is able to build a solid foundation for the different sciences. So metaphysics is, for its proper methodology, the best science for this role. It is not my idea. I think it's very fruitful today.
Great, thank you very much. If we don't have any more questions, I don't suppose it would hurt to move on to the next talk a little bit early, just because I know Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So if that's all the questions, Professor Consionti, thank you again for your wonderful talk. It was a real privilege having you with us today.
Thank you.
Christian thought faces unprecedented challenges, ranging from a denial of metaphysics to previously unforeseen ethical and moral questions arising from contemporary science and ever-advancing technologies. The theme of our 2022 conference, The Future of Christian Thinking, seeks to think from out of these unprecedented challenges, while simultaneously straining to look into a nebulous and unforeseen future. A vast array of many of the foremost thinkers engaged with Christian thought have been invited to speak on these issues. These thinkers are representative of many different schools, approaches, and styles of Christian thought across confessional divides. And together, the ever-pressing question of the future of Christian thinking will be pondered from within an intellectually polyphonic and ecumenical conversation. Conference keynote speakers include Rowan Williams, Eleanor Stump, David Bentley Hart, Robert George, John Milbank, Cyril O'Regan, Thomas Joseph White, D.C. Schindler, Francesca Erin Murphy, Connor Cunningham, Judith Wolfe, Patrick Lee, Rudy Tavelde, Therese Ann Druart, Philip Rosemond, Meta Lebec, Caitlin Smith-Gilson, John Canassis, and Gavin Kerr. This event will also be used to launch our new lecture series in Christian philosophy with our inaugural lecturer, William Desmond. William Desmond will be followed in the spring of 2023 with Cyril O'Regan as our second speaker in this lecture series. COVID-19 has struck hard at the communal life of the world. One of the ways it has affected academia deeply is in the loss of our beloved communal events of academic conferences. We are all aware that what makes these events beautiful and integral to the meaning of academia is the overflowing of conversation begun in the keynotes and panel sessions into the communal gathering outside of the formal setting. It is in the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine, in the meeting between old friends and the making of new, that gives flesh and blood to the spirit of the life of the mind and our intellectual endeavors. It is thus with an eager heart that we at St. Patrick's College Maynooth await the time when we are able to welcome you with Irish hospitality amidst the imposing yet inspiring cloistral hush of our historic campus. More information on this event can be found on our website, and registration is via Eventbrite. We would be grateful if you aid us in spreading the word.